So I am Adela Ramos. My pronouns are ella, she. I'm the Director of Partnerships and Communications at the Tacoma Tree Foundation. And as part of my role, I oversee our education program, which is possible thanks to Tacoma Creates support. And Courtney, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Courtney Bird. I am the outgoing director of the Job Carr Cabin Museum in Old Town in Tacoma. And I am leaving that role because my family is moving, but it's been a joy to be a part of, and I'm really excited to be a part of this webinar as one of the last things that I get to do.
Mhm. Yes, thank you, Courtney. And so a little bit of Tacoma Tree Foundation, if you're not familiar with us, we're a local nonprofit committed to growing Tacoma's and Pierce County's urban tree canopy. Tacoma is one of the cities in Western Washington, well, is the major urban center in Western Washington with the least amount of tree canopy. So we're trying to make sure that we can grow a healthy tree canopy for generations to come and support neighbors and residents with free educational programming that can help them both take care of those trees and connect with trees through social, scientific, and creative means.
And the Job Carr Cabin Museum is a small local history museum in Old Town Park here in Tacoma. We are celebrating our 25th anniversary this year, but the museum itself is a replica of Job Carr's first residence here in Tacoma. He was the first non-native settler who arrived in Tacoma in 1864 and built his cabin in 1865. And a lot of the work that we do is through our school programs and making sure that history is accessible for everyone who is here and that local history is something that we keep alive for students and people of all ages.
Thanks, Courtney. So today we're going to, before we hand it over to our speakers, we're going to go over webinar logistics, um, the land acknowledgement, introductions to our speakers, and then we'll move into the conversation and end with what we hope will be a lengthy Q&A so that you can engage with our speakers. So we're approximating about a 40 to 45 minute set of presentations followed by about 30 minutes of a Q&A to answer all your questions and just engage in conversation. Courtney, one note is I cannot see my notes right now, so would you mind introducing all of the speakers yourself? We were
Sure.
going to rotate, but okay, thank you. Um, so on that note, this is a webinar technically, but we've formatted it as a meeting to make sure people who wish to see each other and engage with each other through chat can do so. We often have people who know each other in the room, and that always generates a sense of togetherness that we want to preserve. And also this allows you to be a little bit more connected to our speakers. That we ask that for this to be successful, you just keep yourself muted during their presentations. For the Q&A, you can unmute yourself if you want, or you can put your questions on the chat and I will make sure to read them aloud for our speakers. So whatever you feel more comfortable with. We do ask you to hold those questions until the end of the presentation. And I'm hoping everything goes super smoothly, but in case we lose signal or have to just shut the room and then reopen, we ask for your patience. We'll definitely make sure to keep things rolling as smoothly as we can. And with that, I'd like to just share the Tacoma Tree Foundation's land acknowledgement. At Tacoma Tree Foundation, we acknowledge that our work takes place on Indigenous land. Despite generations of violence, Coast Salish people still live here, practice their cultures, and care for these lands and waters. We honor and respect the sovereignty of all tribal nations, both here and around the world. Our urban area was and is being built by immigrants and people of color whose labor and cultural contributions to the modern identity of Greater Tacoma we also recognize. And today's webinar is one of the ways in which we attempt to recognize the existing Coast Salish practices and the history of our city and Pierce County region, and think about ways in which we can continue to steward the land by honoring all of those of us who are here and have been here.
And I'll follow that up. Thank you so much, Adela, by saying that at the Job Car Cabin Museum, we host a lot of kids on field trips, and we always begin our field trips and any of the work that we do with our students with a land acknowledgement. And during that time, we also ask them to honor the stewardship, the many, many, many generations of stewardship of the indigenous tribes of this area and the Puyallup tribe, um, by continuing to honor the land and care for the land, care for each other, care for our cities. And whenever we've been presenting lately to adults, we've been asking them to do the same thing, to continue to care for each other, to care for the land, to care for each other. And it's something that we, um, as we were thinking about our 25th anniversary and what we could do, we thought we'll plant fruit trees and have conversations about the history of those trees. And Job Carr was actually a fruit tree planter. He was an orchardist and trained to be an orchardist in Iowa, where Josiah is joining us from today, and planted fruit trees that are purportedly still living here in Tacoma. And so we're super excited to be finding a way to look towards the future of the land, and think about how we care for it and each other. So thank you.
Thank you, Courtney. And we'll say more about the fruit planting at the conclusion of the presentations and Q&A. So with that, we're excited to, start to hand it over to our speakers. Courtney?
Super excited to welcome all three of our speakers here today. We'll first hear from Kalicia Bean. Kalicia manages the sustainability program for the Puyallup Tribe of Indians, where she leads initiatives focused on environmental stewardship, tribal food systems, and community resilience. With a background in agricultural science and natural resource stewardship, her work centers on strengthening Indigenous sustainability, Indigenous food sovereignty, and climate adaptation. Her work is grounded in collaboration, cultural knowledge, and sustainable community development. Next, we will be hearing from Josiah Pollock. Josiah Pollock is an agricultural historian and Iowa State University Extension professional in organic agriculture. His research couples an understanding of mid-19th century agricultural practice with modern organic farming. A native of the Pacific Northwest, his research is influenced by the agricultural history of the Hudson's Bay and Puget Sound agricultural companies at Fort Nisqually and the Cowlitz Farm. He won the University of Washington Tacoma History Paper Prize in 2018 for his research on the Cowlitz Farm, an important tribal and settler community farm in Washington State. And then we will hear from Chris Madden, who serves as the Puyallup Tribe's Agroecology Project Coordinator, bringing extensive expertise in conservation, sustainable agriculture, native plant systems, and environmental stewardship. As a fruit tree specialist, Chris leads the strategic development of the tribe's 5-acre agroecology and food sovereignty hub, an initiative designed to advance climate resilience, sustainable land management, and culturally grounded food systems. I'm so excited to hear from you all. Thank you. And some of the questions that we put to our presenters to guide what we're going to be hearing about today and to guide their conversation, just to start us off with these presentations. I'll just read some of these questions for you. So what is the cultural significance of the Pacific crabapple to the Puyallup tribe? What is the history of early apple tree cultivation in the Puget Sound? How did this introduction impact the native Pacific crabapple and other native fruit species? How did settlers use the Pacific crabapple? Did that impact cultivation of the apple tree? What does the history of the apple tree and its symbolism tell us about the tension and collaboration between tribes and settlers and their relationship with the land? And lastly, leading us into the future, the present and the future, what are current cultivation and or distribution practices of each, and how does this history relate to current food justice issues? So that's a lot to pack in, and I really appreciate you three tackling it, and I'm sure that other questions will come up as we're in conversation. So thank you so much. So Kalicia, without further ado, when you're ready.
Okay. Hi everyone. I just sent a request to share my screen.
I have granted the request or the permission, Kalicia, so whenever
Okay.
you're ready.
Perfect. Okay. Can you guys see this?
Almost. It's coming.
Um, okay. Is it there yet?
Yes, I can
Okay.
see. Thank you.
Okay. Perfect. Well, hi everyone. Excited to chat with you all and be here. My name is Kalicia Bean. I am a Puyallup tribal member, with roots in Yakima and Snoqualmie Nation as well. I currently manage our tribal sustainability program that has a lot of programming, policy, education, and community engagement opportunities in community or climate resilience. And so our program has a large emphasis on Indigenous sustainability and how food sovereignty and our food systems play a role in stewarding our landscapes. So I'm here to give you a very big picture, brief introduction to some of those concepts of Indigenous food systems, and chat a little bit about Pacific crabapple. So firstly, I'm speaking from a Puyallup tribal member and employee perspective. We are one of the many Lachute speaking tribal nations in the Coast Salish territories. Our name in Lachute Seed is Puyallup, and the literal translation means the people from the bend at the bottom of the river. So that refers to dispersed villages that spanned out of the mouth of the Puyallup River near present-day Tacoma Dome area. And prior to settlement, our people lived in villages at the foothills of Mount Rainier, along rivers, creeks, and prairies, all the way to the shores of the Puget Sound. And we intentionally tended many different cultural ecosystems. So we're very rich in natural resources, and that provided for most of our needs. And our economy is based off of a gift economy versus a commodity economy. And so our Indigenous worldview is one where we see nature as living beings in which we can live in harmony and reciprocity with. The land is not something to be conquered, owned, bought, and sold. So very different from modern day. And so, Indigenous knowledge, values, and approach to land stewardship recognize this idea of concentric ecology. And concentric ecology was coined by ethnobotanist Enrique Simon in 2000. Um, and it's a frame, but we've been living it. This is just a name to kind of conceptualize, what it is in the study. And so it's a framework and worldview for land management and food systems based on deep relational, cultural, and ecological practices. So within this ideology, all life is related, and humans are part of our ecosystems, not separate. And our relationships mean that we have responsibility towards our natural resources as well. Um, so some basic principles of concentric ecology are the recognition and inclusion of practitioners and teachers in the system, um, reciprocity in the gift economy, and that there are grounded in local landscapes and can't be generalized. So they're very specific. Our ancestral knowledge and um, our way of learning and interacting with our ecology is very specific to our homelands. There's a lot of stories and ceremonies that are specific to um, our the soil that we're on and have stewarded. So it's different than other Coast Salish nations. And Indigenous food sovereignty it lies within concentric ecology. A lot of the ways that we have interactions and relationships with our natural resources is and tending to them are through food and through seasons. And so our working definition for food sovereignty is a right for a community to have access and ability to define food systems that are nutritious, ethically sourced, environmentally friendly, and culturally appropriate. And food sovereignty encapsulates everything related to health, natural resource resilience, medicine, and our cultural capital. So, with all of that in mind, just going to talk a little bit about how those concepts apply to Pacific crabapple. I'm sure our other speakers will get into the weeds a little bit more about the tree itself, but I'll just give you a glimpse into and how we relate to and look at Pacific crabapple as Indigenous peoples. Um, so this is Pacific crabapple. Next to it, you'll see the Lashutsi name, which I actually don't know how to pronounce. I just wanted to put it there for goodwill. And so Pacific crabapple is native to our Coast Salish lands. It grows near streams and wetlands, and in bogs. Um, it its fruit persists through or into the winter months, and it thrives in it historically has thrived in culturally managed landscapes. So it has a lot of cultural and practical uses, but it's definitely more than just food. Um, but it is edible. The fruit is edible. It can be eaten fresh, or preserved and stored. Um, you can either harvest after, or it's traditionally been harvested either after the first frost to ensure more sweetness. It can definitely be more bitter the earlier you pick it, but it has been harvested in summer months as well, and then would be ripened in baskets made of cattail and stored for winter survival. Another preservation technique has been cooking it lightly and then either preserving it in whole water or in fish oil. And then it would be stored in bentwood boxes of Western red cedar. And that preservation technique was often used as food in ceremonies, different types of ceremonies. Um, let's see. It's also very highly medicinal. There are a lot of different ways to use specific crabapple or Pacific crabapple, but a lot of the times the bark tea was used for a host of stomach problems, including indigestion and ulcers. Um, and the wood was often used for different fishing and hunting implements, like digging sticks and spears. And there's a list of different types of uses that you can look into, but those are just a few common ones. Um, let's see. So how do we find or what do we see in terms of a concentric relationship with Pacific crabapple? So in a concentric worldview, Coast Salish peoples see the crabapple as part of a family system and are treated with respect, gratitude, and protocol. So harvesting was often determined by leadership, um, And harvesting is actually an interaction with this plant, not an extraction. Um, Crabapple is a part of a larger system that protects protected our people and our lifeways. And so care would ensure abundance. Um, and so that's the reciprocity or reciprocal relationship with crabapple. So we would be able to harvest and use as, food and medicine and technology. And in turn, we would be tending through weeding, pruning, and selective harvesting to ensure regeneration. And another part of concentric relationship is that, seeing these different plants as relatives or as kin, we're able to glean ancestral wisdom or lessons from these plants as well. And so, common themes that we can see within crabapple are protectiveness and resilience. So, um, it protects people and lifeways in that it can provide food during scarce seasons for winter storage. It's medicinal for our body and digestive health, and then materials for tools. And resilience can be shown in this plant because it grows in diverse, sometimes harsh environments, like wetlands and hillsides. The fruit persists into the winter, so it provides when food is scarce. Other foods may be scarce, and it becomes sweeter after the first frost. So the lesson or the ancestral wisdom that can be gleaned here is harsh conditions don't weaken it, they transform it. And so there's a lot of other ancestral wisdom that can be gleaned from this plant as well. But those are just a few themes that are present. And so food sovereignty today. So crabapple is definitely one of our traditional foods and a part of our ancestral diet. And so it is a part of food sovereignty and cultural continuity. So it's a traditional food that's tied to our seasonal rounds. It's a connection to our ancestors who harvested from the same types of trees. And it's a teaching tool for younger generations. So protecting crabapple and other ancestral foods is a part of protecting our culture. Okay, and there's my contact info. So a very brief overview, but yeah, happy to answer questions later on in the webinar.
Thank you so much, Kalicia. That was really beautiful and a lot of food for thought. I took a bunch of notes. And I'm excited to ask questions later.
Perfect.
Josiah, would you like to jump in?
Thank you, Kalicia. I'll pick it up kind of at the a little bit of the science about the stuff. So Malus fusca is the Latin name for the Pacific crabapple. And I'm going to minimize all this stuff so I can see my presentation. Okay.
It's still kind of
it.
coming in through the
Yeah.
screen sharing on our end.
Thanks.
Okay. Cool. And so we're talking about some of the differences between the Malus domestica, which is all forms of cultivated apple, which were introduced in the 1820s into the Washington area, and how some of the settlers utilized Malus fusca when they first entered the territory. And oftentimes, and even today, Kalicia did mention the fact that it's very resilient, and there are multiple breeding programs at universities in Europe that are utilizing Malus fusca as a breeding stock and as a root stock for Malus domestica because it has fire blight ability to keep from fire blight. So fire blight is a disease in apples that turns basically burns the shoots of the domesticated apple and it stunts growth. And so they're able to utilize it in developing new rootstocks for apples. And for those of you, we'll get into it as I move on to the presentation, but apples are heterozygous, which means they have to have parents, two parents, in order to have fruit from them from seed. And to get like a true variety, we have to graft that variety onto a rootstock. Whereas planting direct from seed will create a new variety from whatever parent plant that tree had. So we'll get
Josiah,
into more. Yep.
sorry to interrupt you. I can't see your slides and neither can Courtney. Would you mind like unsharing your slides and sharing them back on again? Maybe that'll help.
Yes. Let's
Thank
try
you.
this.
Sorry about that. I don't know what's happening.
It wouldn't be a virtual learning opportunity without some tech issues.
Absolutely.
Exactly. It says that I can't share my screen anymore. Okay, there's the button. Hold up. Okay, I'll try this again.
There it is. Perfect.
Great.
Thank you.
All right. So, we will proceed into the fruit thing. So when the settlers first arrived into Washington Territory,
Oh wait,
they
now it's stuck in click to exit full screen. I think if you just leave the slides, um, as long as we can see them, I think it got stuck in the transition to full screen.
okay. We'll stop sharing then. Okay, how is this?
There we go. Yeah, that's
Okay.
perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
We'll just keep it there.
Sounds good.
When it's and the crabapple is oftentimes utilized in nursery systems as a pollinator because it has a longer pollination window than oftentimes in nurseries in predominantly the 19th century. They would utilize it to extend the length of pollination and improve yields in their orchards. And then the settlers utilized it mainly for um, similar to the tribes as like a winter food. Um, but because it has such high pectin, it was often utilized in preserves and jams and jellies as the pectin source. Um, because they didn't have like, of course, store-bought pectin, and so they could utilize it as that pectin in their preserves to um, make their food, and then they also utilized it as a vinegar source. So that's kind of some of the early settler interactions with the Pacific crabapple. So domesticated apples were introduced by seed in probably about 1826 or 1827. Um, the the common story, and it's been supported by loads of research, so there's some kind of myth to it, but there's also a lot of fact in it, is this gentleman, Emilius Simpson, which 220 years ago today, he joins the Royal Navy and becomes a hydrographer, which means he was creating hydraulical maps or for the Royal Navy and would be employed by Hudson's Bay Company to do the same. And so the sounding maps that we have of the Columbia River and some of Puget Sound were created by Simpson. And so the story goes that he was at a dinner in London before being shipped off to Fort Vancouver in the Columbia Department. And either himself or a lady, they were eating apples at the conclusion of the dinner, and she gave him the seed of the apple to plant when he arrived in Washington. And so he put the apple seed in his waistcoat pocket and forgot about them. And there's some other stories say that they also had grapes at this dinner and they had a grape seed as well, and he put that in his pocket. So 6 months later, He arrives at Fort Vancouver and there's a dinner to host them at the event. And he wears his waistcoat and he reaches into his pocket and finds the seeds of the apple and the grape, or probably just the apple. And so himself, Dr. McLaughlin, who is the head factor of Fort Vancouver, and a gentleman by the name of Pambrun take the seeds and they plant them in a hot box with a glass lid. We probably more like a cold frame, but they were wooden sided, and they filled them with earth and they put the seeds in it. I think estimates that there's a total about 5 seeds that they planted in these boxes, and they put glass on them and they guarded them with their lives, and they put them in the company's store. And later on, they sprouted. If you grow apples from seed, it takes about 10 years before you're going to get fruit. So these apples wouldn't have produced fruit until 1832, 1833. And so Simpson is never actually eats the produce because he dies in 1831 up in northern British Columbia. But commonly, and kind of what I want to get at is there's really Simpson is what everybody points to as being the one who brought apples into Washington, but there is probably a lot of different ways that the apples actually came in to the region. We'll get into some other major characters, but we do know that the Royal Society sent a bunch of seeds and foodstuffs to Fort Vancouver, and Fort Vancouver's head gardener, William Bruce, was trained at Chiswick House in London, which Joseph Paxton, who is the famed gardener that built the Crystal Palace in 1855, was head gardener at Chatsworth, which is in the same area. And so there was deep connections, as always, with Hudson Bay Company and sort of the movers and shakers of modern science for the day. And so a lot of improved varieties would have come over. And skipping around, McLaughlin and these apple seeds may have been planted not as a end source, but they were planted for the purpose of grafting. And so that's when you take a identified varietal stock and you cut a scion of it, and so you leave a little bit of exposed, and those scions can last for months. And there's records of people when they were pushing apples further west, especially into Iowa, where they would dip the scion in beeswax and that would seal the wound, and they could put it in a box and they could carry it with them on their journey. And so it's possible that scions could have been shipped from Great Britain into Washington, and scions grafted, but these early apples were from seed. And when Dr. William Fraser Tolmie, who becomes in charge of Fort Nisqually, comes out here in 1833, he notes in his diary, he's walking through Vancouver's gardens and he sees these young trees that haven't produced yet, but they're budding. And when Narcissa Whitman arrives in the territory in 1836, the trees are fully in production, and McLaughlin, and it's a known fact of him, was always sharing these seeds with the settlers that were arriving in the area, and Narcissa Whitman herself received some of these seeds from this tree, and we know that there was orchards at Walaitapu, their mission over in Walla Walla, and unknown whether it came from these trees or from later plantings, but that's probably what it is. So the tree here is the old apple tree, which has since died. It died in 2021. It was probably 194 years old. And it was believed to be some of those original trees that were planted. But that's hard to know, and there's some discussion amongst historians about it. So we'll move up into Puget Sound and we'll go to Fort Nisqually. So William Kitson was in charge of the fort and was tasked with kind of moving it forward into its agricultural production. It was getting out of the fur trade. And in November of 1834, he writes in the Fort Journal that we got a few apple seeds put into a hotbed made for the purpose. So similar to Vancouver, apple seeds planted underneath glass, and they would wait another 10 years or so before those trees would start to produce. And if you see 1835, our apples or plants look well, and then 1846, apple blossoms opening. And because we don't have records, we're missing a section of the fort records. We don't know when the first apples started to produce, but by the 1850s, definitely apples were in production. And you can see on this picture here, the little dark rectangle. This is the original site down in DuPont. That is the historic orchard. And I read an article about the orchard from December of last year, and they're saying that there's arsenic problems in the soil. That from the smelter, that won't have any effect on the fruit. The fruit won't take up the arsenic and put it into its flesh. Apples already are high arsenic. We know that from their seeds that have arsenic in them. But the fruit of the orchard's okay. It's just everything else around it, soil, contamination, all that, that's dangerous. And there was a group operating that site, taking it and maintaining it. And I'm not certain if they are still functioning. We can get into question and answer about that later. So Fort Nisqually, we knew they had this orchard because we have the historic orchard today, and at the original site, and then at the modern site in DuPont or at Point Defiance, most of the trees in the recreated orchard were grafted from this historic site. And grown up as little babies and then planted out and protected as best we could against the deer. So the father of apple introduction in the area is Henderson Llewellyn. And so he is a abolitionist Quaker from North Carolina via Indiana, then Iowa. And he builds the largest nursery in Iowa. He called it the Cedar Grove Botanical Garden. So he had like a really big idea of what his nursery could be. And he had over 36,000 trees and 40 different varieties, including he would grow herbs and canes and berries and all sorts of stuff at this site. And part of Quakerism, and this is connected with Job Carr, is this idea of horticulture. So it's part of Quaker ethos to be involved in horticulture. And so Henderson and his brother Seth were very involved. And by the 1830s in Iowa, and even by about the 1840s, there were so many nurseries that you couldn't really make a living anymore because everybody had fruit orchards. And so Llewellyn decided that he was going to load his wagon, and he had these specially horticulture wagons that he would fill with soil that he could move from place to place to sell around Iowa. And so he loaded it up with 700 fruit trees, and he drove it 6 months across the Oregon Trail and arrived in the Willamette Valley. 300 trees survived the journey. So he lost over half his stock, and the gentleman who was their wagon train leader was very upset with him because he was the slowest, and his wagon would sometimes be like days behind everybody else because he had to stop and water his trees all the time. So he arrives and he establishes a nursery, and his fruit grafts are they go like wildfire. He's selling them for $1.50 a graft, which is highly expensive. But he doesn't stay very long. His brother ends up taking over the business, and he leaves for California and starts again, fruit orchards in California. So these are some of the heritage breeds that he brought into from his nursery in Iowa, brought here to Washington. Some of these are very common. The Gravenstein is the one that is growing at the fort predominantly at the new site, but there's these other different red Astrakhan, red June, Gloria Mundi, the whole list. All of these have different seasons. And so the red June, that would be a June bearing apple. And the idea was to have fruit from early summer through the winter. And so your later ripening apples would be a more storage apple. Your early apples would be just fresh eating. And then it goes all the way through. So by September, we're well into apple season from a historic orchard perspective. So a lot of his apples and his stock is the backbone of what is in the territory. And this is a advertisement in the Washington Pioneer in 1853 from Leonard Durgin, who had a nursery at Grand Mound, and his stock would have been from Henderson Llewellyn as well, or imports from elsewhere. And we'll see that as we go on, that people started taking grafts from everywhere, and or just they would bring seeds with them, and apples were popping up all over. So Dr. Tolmie at his farm, who was the factor of Fort Nisqually, he left Fort Nisqually in the late 1850s and went to Victoria. And he writes in his account book the different apple varieties that he had on rootstocks. And so we know that these were grafted varieties, not planted from seed. Baldwin, Sweet Pearmain, Northern Spice, Summer Queen, and the Rhode Island Greening. And those are apples that we saw as well on the list from Llewellyn. What's interesting is that on this map of his farm, it shows a designated site for a sweating house. And I was curious to what that was, and that is to make cider with. And so you put the apples in a sweating house so they can sweat, and it condenses their flavor and their sugars so that they're better for cider production. And then he also notes that he received some cherries from Mr. Swan, so that's James G. Swan, who was very famous for a lot of the early work with the tribes in Washington Territory, and that it was all grafted onto wild cherry rootstock as well. And he had pears grafted from a pear tree in one of his gardens. So we assume this is at Cloverdale, this list. It just said 1857 in his account book. It didn't actually say the exact farm, but an entry later on has him counting different cattle groups at Cloverdale. And so the assumption is that that is at Cloverdale. So at Fort Nisqually, Hugh Pattison came in 1856 and was grafting fruit trees from the original site there. And Hugh Pattison is one of the biggest nurserymen north of the Willamette Valley. The Llewellyns were in the Willamette Valley in Oregon. And Pattison was near Fort Steilacoom, and he was a justice of the peace for, I think, 20 years. And this is an entry from the journal, which says him in the garden grafting fruit trees and then planting them as well. He worked for Seth Llewellyn. And he also was from Iowa. But I don't know if he was a Quaker like Job Carr and the Llewellyns. So the original site there in DuPont, the Hugginses, Edward and Letitia Huggins, worked for the fort. And then when Dr. Tolmie left and the territory kind of came under American control, they homesteaded the site. And during the 1860s, Edward Huggins brought in more grafted fruit trees into that original site. Um, and worked with Pattison and others. And the Bigelow house has very old fruit trees that are growing in its front yard down in Olympia. Those are from Pattison's nursery. And they say that he's from like his farm was in the Puyallup area, but I would assume it was probably more towards Stillicum than it would be to what we think of Puyallup today. Um, so these are my sources, and that is me in the apple orchard with Elizabeth Korsmo. Thank you, Elizabeth, for connecting me with Job Carr.
Thank you so much, Josiah. Yeah, I love how the contrast of Kalicia's and your presentation are already bringing up a series of important relationships of questions about the relationships we have with this incredible plant and food. So I'm excited for Chris's um, contribution as well, and then moving into a discussion and Q&A. Hi, Chris. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me. Is everybody still with us?
Yes, everybody is still with us. Everybody loves
I find this fascinating. I was loving the history parts of this. Um, Very cool, very cool. Okay, well, so yeah, what's interesting is so since I was asked about this project and to talk about this, it really got me thinking about um, kind of how Pacific crabapple or Malus fusca was being used and was being grown, and then how obviously the cultivated apple varieties have kind of come into this region, and obviously the Western Washington being the capital of apple growing for a long time until we got irrigation on the east side of the mountains it was a huge impact in this area, probably a huge impact on the tribes of the area as well. Um, I think a few things that I just want to make sure that we touch on in the question and answer part is the fact that Malus fusca has such high pectin content in the crab apples, and from a standpoint of preserving food in those times without refrigeration, that would have been a huge player as far as preserving food. Um, and then I also wanted to just to make sure that people understood kind of what a graft like how a graft works and what a graft was. And so understanding that there's a rootstock and then a clone basically of that apple variety that you want that you like tape together and then create a new tree. Um, but anyway, so I got really thinking about this. And what it ended up taking me down the path of is it kind of steered me towards some of the forest gardens that were kind of planted and some of the archaeological sites up in BC that have kind of been uncovered that kind of challenged the narrative that Indigenous people were just using what the land had given them. And what they were discovering in these forest gardens, kind of all throughout the Salish Sea, so the Puget Sound area, from Alaska down to us here. Um, there are some pretty good examples of forest gardens where they have Pacific crabapple, beaked hazelnut, like thimbleberry, um, Saskatoon, or serviceberry is what we call it here. Not in Canada, it's called Saskatoon. Um, but these plants were planted possibly thousands of years ago. A lot of the age of the trees are in the hundreds, though. And there's some really good examples that the indigenous people were gardening their native plants kind of already. And so the idea of propagating things and growing things in this region is not something that hasn't been already happening. But when that transition of cultivated apples from the east side of the United States during the Oregon Trail movement and coming over through all of these nursery people, which, I mean, what an amazing time to be alive, right? Can you imagine throwing all your nursery stock in a wagon and trying to water it across the Oregon Trail. That would be so, that would be so wild. Um, but anyway, when it got here, it really impacted probably, I would imagine, a lot of the forest gardens um, that were already here. And so what I kind of ended up setting up my PowerPoint about was the difference between indigenous forest gardens and like current agriculture models that we're using now and how that is impacting our environment. And maybe some things that we can do to adjust that moving forward. So I will try to screen share here. Whoops.
I just made you co-host, so you should be able to do that.
Okay. Can you see my screen? There we
There
go.
it is. Awesome.
Okay. And I'll just leave it like this so that it doesn't block me out. Um, so indigenous forest gardens versus conventional agriculture and the impacts on ecosystems over time. Um, so one of the main things that indigenous forest gardens really did a good job of is they aligned with like what we call permaculture today or agroecology today, working with nature rather than controlling it. Um, when we talk about grafting apple trees, you're literally taking a rootstock, cutting off the top of that rootstock, and then grafting a piece of scion wood from another tree and cloning that tree. And so it's not necessarily a way that we work with nature. It's very much like we're on top of nature, controlling nature. And I think that's kind of the theme between the two, between when we look at Pacific crabapple and a lot of our cultivated varieties. The cultivated varieties of apples have come from Kazakhstan along the Silk Road into Europe, been grafted, been shipped across, you know, oceans, and we've really kind of controlled that fruit and created something that is very delicious. But it also has a lot of pest and disease problems. It also can be problematic for soil and erosion and how we manage our fields and things like that. So working with nature rather than controlling it is something that is kind of one of those principles that we look at in agroecology. Um, the forest gardens are regenerative typically. They're very diverse and they're sustainable systems. Um, a lot of them were controlled by, you know, fire and things like that. So conventional agriculture, well, it is pretty productive and we can get high outputs from it. It is more of a short-sighted type of growing food, and there are some pretty serious drawbacks like soil degradation and biodiversity decline. Um, so biodiversity, just these are just some breakdowns of kind of what those words all mean. If people aren't familiar with them, it just means a lot of different types of plants growing together. Um, like I was saying, in those examples that I found were um, there was beaked hazelnut, there was serviceberry, along with the Pacific crabapple. So they weren't just growing Pacific crabapple. They were growing trees, and a lot of these trees were growing along creeks and riverbeds in pretty wet areas. And then also you have to kind of remember that that would have been the transportation for this food also. So if you're coming out of if you're coming out of a creek or a stream or a river, and you've got Pacific crabapple there and beaked hazelnut and all these things that you can eat, um, it's easy to move those things around pretty quickly. The forest gardens are self-sustaining. They rely on natural cycles like decomposition and fire and rainfall. Um, there's no disturbance in those systems, no plowing or heavy soil disruption. And the other thing is they're set up for long-term stewardship. So they're designed to thrive for generations. A lot of these forest gardens were managed by families for generations. Um, Obviously, I think the some of those historic apple trees, the one that died in 2021 was really sad, but we can graft a lot of those and keep them around. I've got a Gravenstein in my yard from my grandma's house that I grafted, and it can mean a lot to us. So it's cool to be able to keep things around generationally. The benefits, though, of the forest garden is it enhances the soil fertility naturally. A lot of the soil fertility in the forest gardens that they've found have been the fertility of the garden is like super, super high. Um, like forget what the name for it is, but there's like a special name for the soil type that is found in those gardens. They support wildlife and pollinators, and they're resistant to pests and disease. So conventional agriculture is typically monocultures. Um, you know, we're growing things at scale now, like corn and wheat and soy, and we're oftentimes spraying a lot of um, pesticides and herbicides on those crops. Actually, I was in Eastern Washington this last weekend, and just driving through Eastern Washington, there was tons of tractors out spraying the fields, and so that type of heavy input is really bad on our health, really bad on the environment. And maybe we can think about how to do things a little differently, and use more of what we have instead of trying to control nature. And I really appreciated what Kalicia was talking about when she was talking about concentric ecology and having that relationship with the land. That is something that we've kind of gotten away from. And obviously, conventional agriculture is really about controlling nature, not about having that relationship with it and working with it to make sure everybody's happy as well as the environment. Um, Conventional agriculture is highly mechanized and uses heavy machinery for planting and harvesting and tilling. Short-term yield focus, so maximizing production per season. How much can you grow in a season, and then ship and commodify and sell that, so that you can basically transition nature into money. Um, some of the drawbacks, obviously, soil degradation and erosion, dependence on chemical inputs, reduced biodiversity. We're talking birds, we're talking insects, so beneficial pollinators. We are moving. I'm sure a lot of people have heard about the bee population problems that we're having. A lot of that comes from our conventional agriculture and our spraying of pesticides on those crops. So that reduced biodiversity is a direct correlation to this movement of crops across the United States, and how we manage those crops and how we control nature. Um, so and they're vulnerable to a lot of pests and market fluctuations. Obviously, I won't get into that. Um, so this is just a little chart here between the forest garden and conventional agriculture. So diversity in the forest garden is high. Conventional agriculture, as far as insects, birds, wildlife, is pretty low, especially in monocultures. Um, I don't know if people have been over to the east side of the mountains recently and kind of looked at all the orchards and what's going on over there. But we're growing a lot of the same types of apples. I did notice some Pacific crabapple in the orchards that was blooming on the ends of the rows, kind of as that pollinator. So we're obviously still using Pacific crabapple, and grafting with it, trying to crossbreed it for its resistance to fire blight and things like that. So it's still a great tree. We just need to use it in better ways. So as far as soil health goes, forest gardens typically improve soil health over time, whereas conventional agriculture oftentimes degrades soil health. The inputs of a forest garden are pretty natural. You're talking about limbs off of trees, plants that come out of the ground that you chop and then put back on the soil, whereas the inputs of conventional agriculture are synthetic chemicals typically. Um, Resilience of the forest garden is very high. The examples are, some of them are still visited. You can still go and visit them today. And we're talking 150 years, 200 years on some of these forest garden sites. That a lot of times people just think it's nature, and it's until you look a little closer. Um, so the time horizon is pretty long term on a forest garden. We're talking generations. Um, Whereas conventional agriculture, we can, um, like Oklahoma is a great example, or I mean the whole Oregon Trail west is a great example of how conventional agriculture has moved into new land, use that land, and the good soil when it's new and was a forest, and then degrades that soil and creates something like a dust bowl, and then pushes further west. And so um, that conventional agriculture across America through the 1800s and 1900s is pretty evident in our soil degradation throughout the country now, and how we've moved agriculture across the country. Um, the ecosystem impacts, obviously, forest gardens are regenerative, bring back all the biodiversity where conventional agriculture is extractive. Um, that's kind of where I've got a I try I was looking at recipes, and this was for a dessert bar for Pacific crabapple. So growing up, I had Pacific crabapple in my yard, and I ate Pacific crabapple all the time. They're very, very tart. Like they will totally stick your lips to your tops of your teeth. Um, and then they get kind of mushy and hang on the tree as they go into winter and become a lot sweeter. So that's when you're wanting to pick them, is when they get kind of mushy and hang on the tree. And you do need to clear out the seeds when you're cooking with Pacific crabapple. And so the seeds inside the little tiny um, fruits are kind of tricky to get out, and I've never done that. But this is a recipe that I found that I really wanted to try. And then I just wanted to write down some of the examples of the forest gardens that I'm kind of talking about that are in BC. So um, Kitselis Canyon, BC is one of the big forest gardens that they found, including Malus fusca, so it has Pacific crabapple specifically in it, along the creek beds, and very dense plantings along with the beaked hazelnut. And then I think Quidsu, and that's up and then Victoria, BC creek bed. So um, definitely not a historian on my side of things as an agroecology person. So I appreciate the history lesson side of things. But I hope that people, when they're thinking about the history of how these apple varieties got here, and the transportation of agriculture, across the United States, and what that has done to the tribes and the native plants and the ecosystems that we live in today. Um, so that's all I've got. I'd love to open it up for questions and um, go from there.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thanks so much to the three of you. This is really, really fascinating, and I'm excited for our conversation. I'd love to start by giving you a chance to respond to each other or just ask each other questions for about 5 minutes. If there's anything, Kalicia, Josiah, and Chris, you want to ask each other, and then we can also give time to the audience to start thinking about their questions. And for the audience, just a reminder, you can either raise your hand so that we have like a line of questions that I can call on, or just write your question in the chat and send it to me, or share it with everyone, and I'd be happy to read it aloud for our speakers. So with
Should
that,
we
yeah, go ahead, Chris.
should we go ahead and answer the questions that you guys asked kind of right off the bat? I noticed there was a bunch in there about some things on like how we're using Pacific crabapple today and things like that. And so if I don't know if
Sure.
we covered all of those, or if you wanted us
Um,
to kind of answer any of those questions first.
yeah, I would love for you to answer any of these. I just reposted them for anybody who came in later.
Oh, great.
Any of these questions that you want to address directly right now, that would be fantastic. If there's one in particular that.
So I guess the introduction of and the impact on Pacific crabapple, I don't actually think that the Pacific crabapple has been impacted too much by current apple varieties, besides being used as a pollinator. So it's complemented them, if anything. Um, and then how did the settlers use Pacific crabapple? Probably mostly for preserving with its natural pectin, and adding some flavor to things. Um, I think a lot of these I think we covered already.
Yes, yes,
That's
absolutely.
great. I'm happy that we got these pretty covered.
Hmm. We thank you for it. Thanks.
Yeah.
Um, okay, Alicia, Josiah, do you want to say anything before we move into questions?
I just wanted to reiterate some things that Chris was talking about like diversity and biodiversity on farms and how we're losing a lot of that, especially when it comes to commercial apple production. If you go into the grocery store, you have an option of like four, maybe five varieties of apples to buy from. And if you saw the list that of the different cultivars and things that were grown historically, there was so much more diversity and so many more. And each apple seed that is planted is a different variety altogether. And because of cold storage and things like that, we don't have to grow long storage varieties or short early spring or early summer. And so that's an area that we lose again because we have cold storage and we have the ability to grow the best, most flavorful or not most flavorful apples, but ones that can just live in cold storage for years and years and years. So it's important to have major diversity, especially in your orchards too.
Yes, I think that was a striking detail between Kalicia's overview and your presentation, Josiah, how Kalicia mentions that the elders are the ones who determine the time of harvesting and growing, whereas I think it was Llewellyn that was interested in maximizing production. So summer to December, we have apples for every season. And of course, that's still much more productive and sustainable than what we're doing now with refrigeration and
Mhm.
And yeah, and where we're at now is it's how many apples can we grow and then store and then ship and commodify. So even when you're planning on growing apples from early June to late October, you've got a good amount of biodiversity. You've got a lot of different varieties of apples. Your pollination windows are quite long, and that is hugely helpful for pollinators, and wildlife. So it's not that is a bad way of growing food. It's that what we've gone from there into this current agricultural system of monocropping, high yields. And trees aren't really growing like fruit trees anymore. We're trellising most fruit trees now. So we grow them on a vine, like a trellis system where we V-shape them, grow them at 45-degree angles, and cut them out every 10 years and fully replace the trees. So it's like a really extractive farming practice that we're using for apples nowadays. Um, Interesting to learn about how we got there. I thought I saw someone's hand go up. Amy.
yes, Amy, we don't want to lose
Hi. Yes, I thank you very much for that awesome presentation. I loved each one of you gave a different perspective. And it's interesting because right now I'm working on a restoration site, planting with some students, and the nursery specialist had said, "Oh, I have some crabapple. You should add crabapple." And I was like, "Oh yes, why didn't I think of crabapple?" And so it's one of those. I feel like, and then I seen the webinar, and I was like, "Okay, there's something about crabapples right now that I'm supposed to learn." The crabapple is trying to teach me something. So it was really interesting that just so full circle. I'm going to meet with him tomorrow morning. I actually shared this webinar with him, but I don't think he was able to get on. So I'm hoping by introducing that plant at our site, and then Kay, it's so good to see you. It's been a long time. So I'm going to send you an email, and maybe I can get some more information to bring into our student planting site to talk a little bit more about the crabapple. So, but my question was, because I feel like it's not one that was really talked about in a lot of my, like, I was working with Metro Parks Tacoma, and then with some of my training as a habitat steward specialist at UW Tacoma. Not a lot about this tree. So, how, like, as far as, and it sounds like it would, I mean, it's a pretty important, hardy, resilient plant. So, where could you find more information about, like, I guess from not just the Indigenous history, but is there other, like, more writings or like the historic pieces? Because Josiah talked about kind of settlers coming in, but yeah, so I guess I'm kind of all over the place with that question, if that made any sense.
I kind of looked into some of, like, are you thinking about more planting guide stuff? Because there are some planting guides through, like, the conservation district if you're thinking about how and where to plant it. But if you're thinking about how it moved throughout the Pacific Northwest, or how it got here, or kind of where it's come, I think
Yes.
it is I think it also is in China. Josiah might know better than I do, but when I was kind of looking into it, of like where else these apple that Malus fusca is found, I think China is the other area. And so um, I have a feeling, you know, well, that's complete. That's just my brain wondering what, how plants move through space and time with people. Um, and so I won't talk too much about it, but yeah, I think this variety of plant is also found in China
And
or in
it,
Asia.
yeah, I think Kaylee
Yeah,
said,
and I was gonna say, I know that hi Amy, it's good to hear from you. I think our heritage department, they had gotten a lot of information about, like, the history and cultural significance of a bunch of different native plants from it might be the Burke Museum in Seattle,
Mhm.
but if you email me, I can get in touch and find out directly what source that was. But you can also contact our historic preservation department because they have a lot of archaeological, articles and things that they've collected about native plants over time as well. So that's just something to think about. I'm not sure if specifically they have Pacific crabapple, but um, it's worth an ask.
But yeah, it is interesting how and I wonder if you guys know, so there was the Burke Museum did that study where they were able to like that map of the waterlines map. I'm sure you remember seeing that. And so there were seeds found in certain areas. Um, do you know if the crabapple was one of those seeds that they had found when they did the um that map? I'm just curious. I haven't looked, but I wonder if you guys knew.
Are
I
you talking? Sorry, go
oh
ahead, Kalicia.
you can have it. I actually am not familiar, so
Are you are you talking about the study where they took those soil cores and then they, like, counted so many layers and then grabbed, like, vegetation from those different layers?
Yeah, and then they were able to kind of show what was like over the last 20,000 years, and we're able to kind of layer it out. Um,
Yeah. I don't know 100% if they found Pacific crabapple seed in the cores that they took, but I do know that that's, like, hydrology has been huge for like taking lake cores and trying to find out what the native vegetation was in those areas. But I would assume that it probably was present since it grows in water zones, right? So it can be travel through streams and lakes and rivers and probably carried by salmon as well and deposited.
Did that answer your question, or were all of your questions answered, Amy?
Stable, so
Oh,
having a little bit of issues. But yes, thank you very much. I appreciate the webinar. I appreciate the conversation and looking forward to new relationships.
thanks for being here, Amy, and thanks for your questions. Other questions for our speakers? Courtney, I can see your hand. Just unmute yourself.
Still muted. Sorry. I do have a lot of questions, but I'll start with I keep coming back to this. I mean, what was very stark to me between Josiah and Kalicia's presentations was the idea of the gift economy versus the maximization of profit and oh no, did we lose Josiah? And how those early Iowa and Indiana orchards and the folks that had started them weren't able to make a profit there. So they're thinking, how else can I make a profit? How else can I sell these grafts or scions or trees? And I'm just curious, like looking forward, I feel like in parts of our culture, we've gained a little bit more awareness of the benefits of diversity in our um, different environments and the way that we cultivate food, but that's still not the primary way that we farm and the narrative. And is there, this is such a hard question, but how do we get back to more of that? And I know it's in some level, these conversations and making them more relevant, but it seems like the only sustainable way to move forward. And so I'm just curious, how do we get back to that more of an idea of a gift economy and that kind of kinship with nature? That's a hard question and impossible, but I'm
It's a
like,
great
it feels
it's a
so
great question. I often wonder
discouraging thinking about
that.
how
I wonder
we
that.
have gotten so far from it, and it's what's needed for us to.
I typically think that we have gotten so far from that because you cannot profit off of a gift economy. And,
Yeah.
and we cannot be where we're at today if that were to exist. So it's by design, and it's probably a lot of the reasons why so much terrible history has happened to the native people of this place, because we had to erase that system to make this one, most likely.
It doesn't fit in the capitalist model.
Doesn't fit.
Yeah. And I will say, I don't know that I have all the answers for that question. It's such a big question, but I really loved, how Chris kind of compared, the forest gardens versus conventional agriculture. And I think with the kin-centric ecology, one of the basic principles is that the practitioner is not excluded from these systems, right? So like they're oftentimes, is this thought that, oh, people are the problem. People should stay out of nature. Or we should just let them, let nature do its own thing. And that's kind of not the idea. Like we are definitely a part of these ecosystems, and the more that we recognize that as people, the more that, this always feels like the same answer to a lot of questions, but like it is like really educating people about the impact of, or what's happening in our food systems and how they used to be versus how they are now. And that there are ways to actually interact with our food systems without, doing any harm or negative impacts. And so I think that's kind of our mission with even the Tribes Food Hub is that there are ways of being involved in food systems that are beneficial. and people are needed and are part of our food system. So just wanted to put that little seed there.
Thank you.
That's a much more positive answer than mine. I was gonna say you could also always just grow a pear, um, or an apple or a cherry or a grape. Growing your own food is a great way to. That's where I really got started with a lot of this stuff. So, the more you garden, you know, the more you're gonna get into this stuff, I think.
Yeah, which I think one that was going to be just a follow-up question. Like if I am somebody in the audience right now, just thinking like, where do I even start? And you've kind of answered that, Chris, starting by maybe choosing more intentionally what you are bringing to your garden or what you are putting in the ground or educating yourself seems to be one way to start and to follow what Kalicia just suggested, that there is a way to if not like obviously fully um reduce damage in what we do individually or in our communities, try to um improve what we're doing. So I think that is an important takeaway for all of us. um Josiah, you're back. Kind of. I think he's frozen. Well, we kind of try to connect with Josiah again. Amy, I see your hand up again.
One thing, just because that question was so good, and Kay, when you were talking, I finished reading The Serviceberry by Robin Kimmerer, and highly recommend that book if you guys haven't read it already, but you probably all have. And there were a couple of things that just gift economy that I'll do some quotes. So gift economies arise from an understanding of earthly abundance and the gratitude it generates. And so going from this scarce place to this place of abundance, well, how do you bring that into society, right? And I think in building that relationship and sharing that understanding is helpful. She goes on to say, the tragedy of the commons. Okay, the currency of this gift economy is relationship and a neighborhood where people know each other's names. Even the conundrum, the tragedy of the commons becomes the abundance of community. This is the gift economy in reach of everyone. It's a subversive and delicious. Regenerative economies that reciprocate. Oh my gosh, I cannot read. Reciprocate the gift are the only path forward. To replenish the possibility of mutual flourishing for birds and berries and people, we need an economy that shares the gift of the earth, following the lead of our oldest teachers, the plants. They invite us all into the circle to give our human gifts in return for all we are given. So I just like, again, to that, relationship and doing these webinars and sharing, the knowledge. And it's just, the little things in which we can do, start a food pantry, the gift, just giving of gifts makes people care a little more and want to give back. It's kind of contagious. Oh, I think I froze again. Thank you.
Thank
I
you,
think we're
Amy.
I think we're all just thinking.
I'll just pondering.
Yeah.
We are 5 minutes away from the end of the webinar, so I wanted to give our speakers an opportunity to maybe just perhaps leave us with a final thought or question that you'd like us to keep in mind as we continue to think about our relationships with obviously the apple, but also other plants in our midst. And that way maybe Josiah can also, we can hear from Josiah before. And Josiah, I think if you shut your video off, you might be able to still speak even if we can't see you. But Kalicia, would you like to get us going?
Yeah. Um, I think just to speak to what Amy was saying earlier, how the Pacific apple was was calling to her and right when she found this webinar. That's oftentimes a lot of teachers that I've had will say that, you'll start getting like you'll start thinking about these plants or seeing them more often, or they'll be more involved in your life and they just come up right when you need them. And so I think maybe just paying attention to little subtle things like that. There's been so many times where like, just dandelions have come up or Devil's Club have come up in my life. And, I've learned more about them throughout the years. But at that time that it comes up there, it's another use for them that I've, needed in that moment. And so I'd say just kind of pay attention to what's calling to you. And then I always forget, like Chris and I are very plugged into like our local food systems, just because we work around these different food sovereignty, agroecology concepts. And so we have a lot of resources available to us. And I always forget that a lot of people aren't always really plugged in or know where to go. So I just wanted to reiterate that I'm available to, provide any resources or connect folks to, classes or books or, just any information that they might be interested in. I'm available.
Thank you so much, Kalicia. Yeah, I love everything you said. And also a good reminder for Courtney and me that if you have resources you'd like us to share with participants, you can we'll email you and collect those, like the recipe, Chris, that you shared, for instance, and share them with participants as well. Thank you. Chris or Josiah?
Josiah, if you can talk, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I'm terribly sorry. My connection just absolutely died, and I was unfortunate to miss most of the Q&A. But go ahead, Chris, and I'll follow up as I catch up with the conversation.
Yeah, we're just kind of giving our final thoughts, right? I guess my final thoughts is I don't mean to be negative and paint a picture of doom and gloom about conventional agriculture and where that's leading us on our planet and how doomed we are. And I think my message to everyone, if you can, if you have access to nature, is go out and start building that relationship with plants. Because like Kalicia was saying, you will start to recognize plants the more you're out there in nature, and those plants can teach you a lot, and you can help plants in all sorts of ways, whether it's just noticing where they're at in their life cycle, or whether they're being pollinated, or what insects are interacting with them, if they need water, or go out and help a plant if you can. And really, gardening is a huge way of how we enter it, like move towards that gift economy and start sharing food in abundance with people. So I don't mean to be negative. My brain kind of sees that picture of the history and how we got here, and it gets to a pretty negative place pretty quickly. And obviously, I'm working at the Food Sovereignty Hub because I want to try to fix these problems. So please go garden and come help us garden at the Food Hub and work with us. And I'm normally very positive and very upbeat. So anyway, have fun gardening. Thanks, everyone.
I definitely reiterate what Chris said about getting outside and experiencing plants and understanding just more about the natural world around. And also just like dig into history, because there's so much about our food systems that we've lost. And we don't really know how to get back there without knowing how the natives used to do their cultivation, their food forests, right? Or how early settlers, I'm not talking about post-war agriculture, I'm talking about early settlers and just their subsistence farms and how they were trying to just keep food on their table, and how they worked with the land or worked against it, and how we can learn from those things. So the Pacific Northwest has a beautiful history, a rich history, and get out and explore and learn about the region and what there is to learn and engage with the agriculture around you.
Thank you so much, Kalicia, Chris, and Josiah. And I think this is just the perfect way to conclude, because when Courtney and I were thinking about this webinar, we were really trying to think about a way to have a conversation about the apple that was not just celebratory, that was about the complexities of the fruit and how its history really foregrounds all of these, the coexistence of all of these tensions of the past and the present, and what we can still do to build and create better relationships with plants. So you've really just kind of helped us achieve that in a really wonderful ways. And we're really, really grateful. And I'd love to give Courtney a chance to say her own final takeaway.
Yeah, I want to echo that gratitude. I'm feeling inspired by the positivity at the end, despite the negativity, Chris. And I sometimes get sunk down into that negative space too when I look at some of the bigger systems that we're in. But I think that idea of getting out in nature, and also, Kalicia, you were talking about like what we can learn, the persistence of the crabapple, the resilience. Like, I think that being able to learn from these plants, like our wonderful teachers, it takes getting out there, and it takes patience to sit there with a plant or to revisit it in different seasons. Um, to look at a devil's club and think, okay, what is this teaching me in this moment or overall? So I really appreciate all of those reminders. And I do think that those lessons come from history, and they also come from the world around us that we're still blessed to be a part of. So thank you so much for helping us make those connections. The Job Carr Cabin Museum, we're planting. So we've got Parks Tacoma on board to work with us to plant some fruit trees this weekend on Friday. And I'm super grateful to Tacoma Tree Foundation as well for helping us out and creating nature zines or nature explorers zines for kiddos about the Pacific crabapple. And yeah, really excited. So thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks to our speakers. Thanks to our amazing audience. Thank you for being here. Just a reminder that the planting starts at 10 a.m. and ends at 2 p.m. and you can join us. We'll be there, TTF and Job Carr, obviously, and Parks Tacoma. And our crabapple zine will also be coming out in Tol Shoot Seed in a couple weeks. We have an English version and a Tol Shoot Seed version translated by Chris Bryden. That we'll also be sharing. So we'll definitely make sure everybody can have access to both. Thank you so much, everyone. I will close the room in about a minute, but let you thank our speakers and take care. Thank you, Courtney. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you all.